Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. I'm Tom, and this is the 9th episode in a series we're doing called The Tanks of World War II. Each episode we look at a different tank from World War II, starting with the beginning of the war and working our way to the war's end in 1945. We're currently on the German invasion of 1940 of France, and the tanks that were used by the French, British, and German forces during that campaign, which is a very broad and large collection of tanks, actually. Probably going to be the longest sub-series within the whole series. Anyhow, we've already examined the Renault FT, the Char D, the FMC 36, the Renault 35 and 40, Hotchkiss 35 and 39, and the Somois S35. That's just the French tanks. Oh boy. This episode, though, we are examining, this is the last of our French episodes, probably, maybe, and we are looking at what is probably the most heavily armed of the French tanks, the Char B1 bis. The Char B1 bis was the most well-armed French tank of the 1940 campaign that saw combat, and it proved to be a formidable opponent to the German invaders. However, its inefficient crew layout and outdated design hampered its effectiveness in certain regards. That said, at the Battle of Stone, a single Char B1 bis would destroy 13 German tanks in one of the most famous actions involving a single tank of the war. After the fall of France, the Char B1 bis would be taken into German service and see combat in German hands throughout the rest of the war, as well as some were recaptured by Allied and French forces at the very end of the war to see a little bit of combat then. Despite its size and power, the Char B1 bis was one of the oldest French designs, having gone through a number of different developmental iterations and versions. Its outdated appearance, looking almost like a World War I tank in some regards, is not an accident, since the origins of this tank started in the immediate post-World War I era based on the concepts of the French tank pioneer General Estienne. Now, by 1921, a commission headed by General Edmond Buat initiated a number of studies on a new char de combat. Now, this was intended to be a tank that was more powerful than the two-man infantry support tanks, such as the Renault FT or the later R35 and H35, but not as big as the heavy tanks that were being planned, such as the massive 70-ton Char 2C. Now, the idea was to have a vehicle that had enough armor to resist fire from field artillery guns, while having the firepower to deal with enemy field work and fortifications. Now, this vehicle was meant to be about in the 15-ton range, and French industry quickly put forward a number of proposals. The different examples put forward by industry were examined, and the commission picked the different features and components that they liked. The companies involved included Renault, Schneider, Saint-Chamond, also known as FAMH, FCM, and Delaunay Belleville. Now, examining the details of each of these proposals could end up being a video all on its own, so we'll skip ahead to 1925 when General Estienne decided to base further development primarily on the prototype known as the SRB, which is one of the two vehicles submitted jointly by Renault and Schneider. Progress on prototypes proceeded slowly, with changes being made to the program as concepts of what a char de combat and the needs put forward by the French government changed over that time period. But by 1930, the first three prototypes had been delivered. Now, this program was given the name Char B, and these three tanks were used for a number of tests and exercises. By April of 1934, orders were placed for the production of the first Char B1 tanks. Now, the Char B1 featured the same APX-1 turret as the older Char D2 tanks, which we covered in a previous episode, which had the short SA-34 47mm gun and about 40mm of frontal armor. By the late 1930s, it was recognized that these features needed improving, and frontal armor was increased to about 60mm, and the APX-4 turret with the longer SA-35 47mm gun was introduced. Engine power was increased as well, and changes were made to increase the fuel capacity of the vehicle. These changes resulted in the Char B1 bis, of which 369 were produced. Multiple French firms were involved in the production of these vehicles, with Renault being the lead producer. Now, the Char B1 and the B1 bis were very expensive tanks, and production numbers never met the expectations of the proponents of the char de combat due to the limitations of French military budgets of that period. The Char B1 bis is a very unusual and rather dated looking design. As we said earlier, at first glance it almost looks like a World War I era tank, although maybe with a more modern turret put on top of it, and that's almost an accurate description of it. While certainly it's not a World War I design, The hull did feature a fixed 75mm gun, sort of similar in concept to the World War I era Saint Chamond tank, and then it had the tracks kind of going all the way around the hull in the same way as the British World War I landship designs. It's a tall vehicle with slab-sided riveted sides. The vehicle certainly looks rather dated when it finally went to large-scale production in the late 1930s. The turret, of course, is more modern, being very similar to the turret on the Sommois S-35 tank, and it was cast rather than riveted, making it look rather mismatched compared to the hull. Now, of course, the turret was designed by a government agency, whereas the hull was designed by private industry, so that's part of the reason for the difference in appearance. Now, at about 30 tons, it was one of the heaviest tanks on the 1940 battlefield, and certainly heavier than any of its German opponents. All that said, it did have formidable armament and armor, which made it a dangerous adversary in 1940, starting with the fact that it featured both a 75mm howitzer and a 47mm gun, along with 2 machine guns. However, the layout of these weapon systems was far from ideal, and hampered the effectiveness of the crew. The turret was the APX-4 design, and featured the same 47mm gun as mounted in the S-35 Sommois tank. Now, this gun was an effective design by 1940 standards, and could penetrate the armor of any of its German opponents at standard battlefield ranges of 1940. However, as we have seen with many other French turret designs of this period, it's a one-man turret, meaning the commander has to not only command his tank, but also load, aim, and fire the gun. Now, standard French 7.5mm Rebelle machine gun was mounted in the turret as well. As with other French turret designs, there was no top hatch, just a vision cupola at the top of the turret. The 75mm howitzer mounted in the hull was rather unusual in that it did not have any traverse at all, only elevation, as did the hull-mounted machine gun. This meant that the driver had to also serve as the gunner, turning the tank left or right to bring the gun on a target. Fortunately, the Char B1 BIS had a very advanced transmission that allowed for this sort of precision steering, but it was certainly not an ideal design. In fact, had the war not interrupted French tank production, the Char B1 Tur, the successor design to the BIS, was to feature a hull cannon with traverse. Now, the gun itself was a rather short-barreled and low-velocity affair, being converted from a fortress gun design. Its armor-piercing capacity was limited by its low velocity, and in fact was less than the 47mm gun in the turret, although it's probably fair to assume that the high explosive shells from that 75mm gun could still do serious damage to the lightly armored German tanks that it faced. However, its primary purpose was for use against enemy field works and fortifications, not enemy vehicles. One interesting feature of the cannon is that it was equipped with a compressed air system which blew the smoke and fumes of the gun out the barrel after firing, a system that the French would continue to incorporate into their tank gun design post-war. Much like the commander, the driver was in some ways overworked, expected to both drive and aim the hull gun. Also situated in the hull compartment was the loader for that hull cannon, working in fairly cramped conditions, as well as a 4th crew member who served as the radio operator. While a rather large and long vehicle when viewed from the outside, half the length of the vehicle is taken up by the engine and transmission compartment, meaning the crew compartment is smaller than one might imagine. For those curious, we would recommend the Chieftains Inside the Hatch episode on the Char B1 BIS to see the operating conditions for the crew, and we'll provide a link in the description of this video for that video for people who would like to see it. Now, interestingly, the engine compartment, which was quite large, was accessible from the interior of the tank via a fairly sizable door. The armor protection was very good by the standards of the day, with the B1 BIS boasting 60mm frontal armor, an increase from the 40mm of the earlier B1 variant. This made it the best protected tank in the French arsenal, and second only to the famous British Matilda II tank in the 1940 campaign. Unlike many of the French tanks that utilized castings for their hull armor, the Char B1 BIS featured flat riveted armored plate. One rather unusual feature of the armor design was the large grate on the left-hand side of the tank for the engine radiators. Of course, in most tank designs, the grates for the engine are on the top of the hull rear, not the side where they're exposed to enemy fire. While there are stories indicating that these grates were weak spots that enemy anti-tank gunners could take advantage of, the grates were said to offer the same level of protection as the rest of the side armor of the tank. The engine was a Renault inline 6-cylinder, 16.5-liter petrol engine producing 307 horsepower, which is a pretty respectable power output for 1940 standards. This engine propelled the tank at a top speed of roughly 16 miles an hour. The tank had a range of approximately 60 to 90 miles, depending on conditions, although fuel consumption was an ongoing source of controversy for this vehicle. Early variants of the vehicle were even equipped with a fuel trailer, although these were quickly dropped, as trailers and tanks are never a good combination. In action, it was discovered the tank had enough fuel for 5 to 6 hours of operation, which proved a tactical liability. Also, the engine required high-octane aviation fuel rather than regular auto gasoline, which of course presented a logistical issue. The transmission was one of the most advanced features of the tank and used the Nader hydrostatic system for steering. Now, this system allowed for the very fine turning required to aim the hull cannon, something most transmissions and steering systems of the day probably would not have been able to do effectively. It was a complicated and expensive system, though, and was slated to be improved in the B1 Tur, although that version of the tank never made it into mass production. One interesting thing to note is that the transmission required castor oil as a lubricant, an issue that caused problems when troops confused automotive or machine-appropriate castor oil with pharmaceutical castor oil. There's a difference between the two. The tracks and suspension are of a rather old-fashioned design by 1940 standards, with at least one source describing them as, quote, a development of the Holt tractor type. Now, of course, it's hard to see the suspension since it's hidden behind the side armor, but it consists of 16 road wheels per side. There are 3 bogies of 4 wheels each bogie being suspended on a vertical coil spring. Then there are 3 separate road wheels in front of the bogies on leaf springs, and then one also on leaf springs in the rear. The drive sprocket is, of course, in the rear of the tank, and the front idlers stick out beyond the front of the hull, much like a World War I tank or the British Churchill. Being a fairly long and narrow vehicle, it's fairly obvious this design was optimized for trench crossing, another nod to French expectation of a World War I style battlefield. The French did not use the Char B1 as the base to any other more specialized vehicles. There was the Char B1 Tur, which was an improved version of the battle tank presented in 1937, although only 5 of these were built and they did not see combat. The main improvements of the B1 Tur were changes to the hull shape and armor layout, the addition of a 5th crew member, and the addition of traverse to the hull-mounted 75mm cannon. However, the Char B1 bis would see service throughout the war in a number of different configurations with the German army. As with other French armored vehicles, the Wehrmacht absorbed the French B1 inventory into their own panzer forces, using it as a gun tank in some second-line panzer units, but also as the basis for a flamethrower tank and a self-propelled gun. The flamethrower variant was named the Flammwagen auf Panzerkampfwagen B2F, and the Char B1 was well suited for this role. With its good frontal armor, it could get relatively close to targets with some immunity, which is essential for a flame tank, and by replacing the hull cannon with the flame projector, they could preserve the turret and 47mm gun to function as a regular tank when needed. They also converted 16 Char B1 bis hulls to carry 105mm field guns to operate as self-propelled guns. Now, given the weight and fuel consumption of the B1 bis, one wonders if this was really the best use for such a chassis compared to the conversions done with some of the smaller captured French tanks into self-propelled guns. Now, it's probably worth mentioning here the ARL-44, even though it's not a B1 variant per se. During the German occupation, tank development continued in France, although on a clandestine level. The ARL-44 was an attempt by the French to develop a heavy tank at the end of the war. Initial prototypes were tested in early 1946, and it was obvious that this tank was heavily based on the Char B1 Tur in terms of suspension and hull design. This, of course, meant that the vehicle was outdated before the first prototype was ever even built. Now, only 60 ARL-44s were built in the immediate post-war time period, and the vehicle was made unnecessary by French acceptance of U.S.-made patent tanks to re-equip their army. However, the ARL-44 is an interesting example of the B1 legacy surviving into the post-war period, albeit not very successfully. The Char B1 served with the armored divisions of the infantry branch, the divisions Cuirassiers de Reserve, or DCR we'll call them. These were highly specialized offensive units to break through fortified positions, while the cavalry DLMs were more like a traditional tank division intended for breakout and exploitation. The DCR is smaller, lacking a reconnaissance unit and having less infantry assigned to it. Now, the DCR is intended as a breakthrough unit, accomplishing its mission through the firepower and armor of their tanks, despite being a relatively small unit compared to other armored divisions. Now, when fighting broke out in 1940, there were 3 DCRs in service and a 4th one being formed, and these were equipped with, at least on paper, 2 battalions of Char B1 BIS and 2 battalions of Hotchkiss H-39 tanks. Now, on paper, each DCR was supposed to have a total of 160 tanks, 70 of which were the Char B1 BIS and 90 which were the Hotchkiss H-39s. Now, 4 DCRs will participate in the 1940 fighting, although some were still in the process, as we said, of forming up, and not all had their full allotment of equipment. Now, seldom do these units get used in their intended fashion as breakthrough units, smashing holes through the enemy lines. Rather, they often got broken up and used to reinforce different positions, and used piecemeal, leading to them being quickly ground down in numbers and equipment. Now, the last DCR that was formed, which was the 4th, was commanded by a French officer named Colonel Charles de Gaulle, who you might recognize the name. And, of course, he would become fairly famous later on as the commander of the Free French Forces, and eventually, one of the primary political leaders of France in the post-war period. In our last episode on the Somme S-35, we saw how the DLMs, which were the cavalry armored division, so to speak, were part of the Allied mechanized force that rushed into the Low Countries to meet what the Allies mistakenly thought was the main German advance. Now, the DCRs, which were equipped with the B-1 BIS tanks, were not used in that same manner, but rather in a variety of different locations and situations. Unfortunately, oftentimes they suffered losses due to the tanks having mechanical failures or logistical shortages of fuel while conducting road marches, or they were frittered away piecemeal, used as mobile pillboxes or parceled out in small numbers to support other units. Now, one of the most notable actions involving the Char B1 BIS was the Battle of Stone, a French town that changed hands some 17 times between French and German forces, and was compared by veterans of the battle to the World War I Battle of Verdun. Now, this battle featured the 2 Char B1 BIS battalions of the 3rd DCR, and involved a number of fights, tank-on-tank fights between French and German armor. Now, the most famous incident happened on the 16th of May, when a single B1 BIS, commanded by Captain Pierre Belot, engaged and destroyed 13 German tanks while driving his tank into the village of Stone. Now, the tank safely returned despite being hit some 140 times. Belot's tank was an extreme example, but it shows how the heavy armor and firepower of the Char B1 BIS made it a formidable opponent within the 1940 context. After the fall of France, the remaining B1 BIS tanks were taken into the German inventory and saw action in a variety of theaters. The flamethrower and 105mm self-propelled gun versions were used on the Eastern Front, while some of the tank gun versions were used in second-line panzer units in France and other locations, or as training vehicles. Now, the flamethrower variant saw action in the famous Battle of Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, and oddly enough, a battalion of B1 BIS gun tanks and flame tanks was, rather inexplicably, sent to occupy the British Channel Islands. Now, the B1 BIS that's on display at the Bovington Tank Museum is one of these Channel Island tanks that the British captured at the end of the war. Italy also captured a number of B1 BIS tanks in 1940. However, these vehicles were not all complete, and it's doubtful the Italians used these vehicles in combat. Of course, with the liberation of France in 1944, Free French forces were able to capture a number of Char B1 BIS tanks back from the Germans. Now, the largest collection of these tanks were incorporated into the 13th Dragoon Regiment of the Free French forces. The most notable example of them using their Char B1 BIS tanks in combat was in April 1945 during the Allied attack at La Rochelle. The Char B1 BIS is a rather hard vehicle to sum up in a single word or phrase. On the one hand, it was the heaviest and most powerfully armored and armed tank to see combat in 1940, as we've said several times in this video. In more than one instance, B-1 tanks proved a serious obstacle for German forces, who at this stage of the war possessed few anti-tank weapons capable of easily piercing the frontal armor of the tank. That said, in almost every other respect, the Char B1 BIS could be considered a failure at certain levels. The layout was archaic and seriously hampered the crew's ability to do their job efficiently. The powertrain was sophisticated but also outdated, and a burden logistically, requiring high-octane fuel and castor oil for the transmission. and also was prone to mechanical failure with a relatively short operating range. These issues may have been surmountable if the vehicle had been used as intended, breaking through enemy lines in a fixed battle environment. But in a constantly changing battlefield of movement like that in France in 1940, these defects proved particularly damaging. Also affecting the performance of these tanks were the training of the crews. Now, despite being a design tracing its origins back to the 1920s, the B-1 BIS was not being produced in serious numbers until 1939, meaning that many crews did not have sufficient time to learn how to operate their tanks at peak efficiency. This, of course, was not the fault of the design itself, but it's certainly worth mentioning in terms of assessing the performance of the vehicle in 1940. The vehicle did make an impact on their German adversaries, who noted how their existing 37mm tank and anti-tank guns were of little use against the B-1 BIS. However, the quick resolution of the French campaign would mean that little was done to upgrade German anti-armor firepower, leading to another heavy tank scare, if you want to call it that, for the Germans a year later when they encountered T-34 and KV tanks during their invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, in German service, the B-1 BIS was used mostly for second-line duty or as a specialized vehicle. Now, the good frontal armor of the B-1 BIS made it useful in flamethrower role, although beyond that, there is not much documentation on what the Germans thought of the vehicle. As a basis for future tank development, the B-1 BIS has little to offer. Being already rather dated in concept by 1940, it's hard to see how the B-1 could have been further developed into something appropriate for the late war and post-war battlefield. We see at least some of its design features, as we said earlier, incorporated into the post-war AL-44, a tank that expert and historian David Fletcher called his #1 worst foreign tank design in a Bovington Museum YouTube video. So that kind of sums up how dated the technology of the Char B1 BIS was, particularly when applied to a post-war design. If you would like to see a Char B1 BIS, be prepared to travel to Europe, particularly France or the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, there's one at the British Tank Museum at Bovington. Like we said earlier, this is one that was captured from the Germans in the British Channel Islands. Now, the French have 3 examples at the Musée des Blindés in Saumur. Again, pardon my French. One is in running condition, one is on permanent display, and then there's a third one in storage that is, I think, like a mine-clearing variant or something. There's also a B-1 BIS serving as a monument in the French town of Stone, where, of course, the B-1 BIS saw such significant action against German armor in 1940. 2 are on display at Mormelen-le-Grand, France, as part of the 501st and 503rd Tank Regiment. And then there are a few other B-1 BIS wrecks that survive in France in private hands, bringing the total known existing tanks to 10, as far as I know. Sources used in this video include French Tanks and Armored Vehicles, 1914 to 1940, by Francois Vauvilliers. From Osprey's Duel series, we have Panzer IV vs. Char B1 BIS by Stephen Zaloga. Also from Stephen Zaloga is from Osprey's New Vanguard series, French Tanks of World War II, Volume 1. Profile 58, French Infantry Tanks, Part 1 by James Bingham. Track Story, Le Chars B by Pascal Danjou. And finally, Panzer Tracks 19-1, Beute Panzer Kampfwagen by Tom Jentz and Werner Regenberg. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. This is the last of our regular episodes on French vehicles. Stay tuned though. Next week we'll come back with probably Panzer 35T, I think is what's next on the list. So we will see you then. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like and subscribe. You can support us on Patreon if you'd like it. Just $1 a month helps pay for resources and cover the costs of recording and equipment and all that good stuff. So anyhow, have a good week and we will see you soon.